Conspirinormal podcast proudly presents the Strange Realities Conference. Strange Realities. Come join us for one day of presentations on the paranormal with live music at night featuring Tim Banal,
the rise and fall of the flat earth theory,
Joshua Cutchin,
alien hybrid lore,
Joe Damari,
pushing the limits of reality,
Guy Malone,
Roswell 1947, what really happened,
Timothy Renner,
Pennsylvania Wildman,
and added to the lineup, Mark Anthony Wyatt,
Cornish legends and UFO sightings,
Zach Hunt,
presentation of his book Unraptured,
followed by a live recording of the Conspirinormal podcast. More speakers and music acts to be announced. October 19, 2019, SIR Nashville.
Tickets and info at www.strangerealitiesconference.com. $40 at the door, $30 pre-sale.
This is Conspirinormal, where the nexus of conspiracy theory and the paranormal meet. And now, we join the show already in progress with your hosts, Adam and Serpo.
Welcome back to Conspirinormal, guys.
Hey.
We are pretty much down to the wire. This is the last episode that you're going to hear before the Strange Realities Conference 2019. Conference. Yeah. So, but we've got a special treat for you guys tonight, and this is one of our most frequent guests and one of our most favorite guests.
Always a pleasure.
Nick Redfern. Welcome back to Conspirinormal.
Hey, Adam. How's it going?
Oh, very, very well. It's finally cooled down here. We're
oh yeah, finally.
Same here.
Yeah, we're not living in a furnace anymore in early October, but it didn't feel like fall very much here in Tennessee.
Yeah.
But so we're going to talk about your book, Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, and this is an interesting one because we're basically talking about how UFOs and disinformation, and how some of this disinformation came from basically the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's a little bit of vice versa too, from us to them. But what kind of sparked your initial interest in writing this book about this Soviet connection to the UFOs and disinfo?
Well, I think the first thing to point out, which I point out in the book as well, is, there's no doubt in my mind that there's a real UFO phenomenon. Now, whether it's extraterrestrial or, like multi-dimensional, extra-dimensional, time travelers, I don't know, but there's no doubt in my mind there's a real phenomenon. But what's become clear over the years is that this real phenomenon has been sort of exploited and manipulated and used by intelligence agencies as a means to sort of freak out the enemy or push them down in different avenues and things like that. And so you have the real phenomenon and you have the fabricated stories for, gain at the height of the Cold War, like when sort of us, versus the Soviet Union and vice versa. And over the years, I sort of picked up on a few stories like this where it seemed as if, the Russians had created some fake stories to sort of try and freak out U.S. intelligence. We're talking about late 40s, early 50s. And the more I looked into this side of things, the more stories that I found that did sort of fit into that category. So that's basically the theme of the book is sort of Cold War era, spy stories, counterintelligence, and that phrase that everybody knows in today's world, Russian meddling.
Right.
So,
Russian collusion. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's basically the theme of the book. It's not so much a book about the UFO phenomenon, but how intelligence agencies on both the East and the West use this real phenomenon as a means to achieve a very sort of strange and bizarre goal.
Yeah, and before we kind of get into all that, I think it's important to cover this idea that our CIA had, and I think they implemented some of this stuff, which is basically the exploitation of superstitions, quote unquote, that they were going over like behind the Iron Curtain in the late 40s, early 50s, and they were doing a lot of things that kind of to push this kind of like a spiritual kind of religious meme to the people there, and how some of that stuff was exploited, because I think that is going to go into kind of also the religious aspect of ufology too.
And religion over there was inherently political and against the political system.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah. It's sort of very different to the situation over here. But, this RAND document that you're talking about that was published in the late 1940s and written by a woman named Jean Hungerford, who worked for the RAND company. And basically, the plan was to sort of create stories to suggest that God and Jesus, etc., were on the side of the Western world, and particularly the United States. And the RAND report talks about how totally fabricated stories were created along the lines of American troops seeing angels and the Virgin Mary following U.S. tanks during the Second World War, which wasn't true at all. It was just a fabricated story to try and lower German morale, and to essentially say, that the Western world has supernatural beings on our sides, which is why we're going to win. And so you had that situation essentially created or expanded on by the RAND Corporation in the late 40s. And they realized that by just sort of tweaking a few stories here and there, which may have been real stories, they were able to create scenarios, as I said, where, God and Jesus were on the side of the West, and the Russians, after the Cold War, and the Germans in the Second World War had better watch out. And from there, they realized that they could exploit other sort of supernatural phenomena, not just, religious-based ones, but, just about every side of the UFO phenomenon as well.
When I was reading that in your book, I was wondering about like the miracles of Fatima, which, I mean, that's 1917, but I was wondering about like, those, the last miracle, the last revelation of Fatima, and how much some of that could have been used by intelligence agencies?
Well, I mean, it could have been. I mean, this subject's sort of so weird and weirdly weird, right. That you can never really rule out anything. And that's why I always say to people, be totally open-minded on what you're doing and what you're researching, and try not to get too tied up in belief systems that might be sort of provoked and created to push you down one alleyway when you should be going down the other alleyway. So, when it comes to this the UFO subject, I don't really rule out very much at all when it comes to manipulation and playing with people's minds, and trying to present scenarios that aren't real scenarios after all. And I think it's an important aspect of the UFO phenomenon that a lot of people just simply don't realize how the subject and the phenomenon have been so radically manipulated by, as I said, by intelligence agencies. And it's just one of those sort of little-known aspects of ufology, but it was one of these little aspects that actually grew and grew and dictated, particularly the contactee movements of the 1950s through the early to mid-60s.
Right, yeah. And also, too, you mentioned in the book, and this is all our intelligence, or rather, I think this is British intelligence, but there's this weird kind of connection to the Flatwoods monster that you talk about.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the more controversial ones in the book, and it's one of these things that caused me a lot of flack. But I mean, I don't care. I've got thick skin. I'll say it as I see it.
Right.
And tell it as I tell it. But yeah, for people who don't know, the Flatwoods monster story revolved around a sighting in late one night in September 1952, where a bunch of people saw this strange light or object streaking across the skies and coming down on the other side of town. So they all headed out there and claimed to have seen this sort of 12-foot tall, not so much like an alien, how you might describe it, but like a metallic, sort of jerky, robotic type thing with these flashing lights coming from it and bright glowing eyes. And it was it's interesting because it's almost unique in UFO history. Nothing else has really been seen that sort of resembles the Flatwoods monster. And of course, the whole group fled the hills and, were gone out from the area in a few minutes. But none of them forgot what this thing looked like. Now, doing some research on this, I found that something that eerily sounded like the description of the Flatwoods monster was actually used in a British intelligence operation in the 1940s in a program run by a guy named Jasper Maskelyne. And he was someone who had like a really alternative, brilliant mindset where he'd come up all with these bizarre, weird ways to try and frighten the Nazis. And one of the plans that he had was to create this sort of 12-foot tall, as is described in the files, like some sort of like a 12-foot tall glowing scarecrow. They would sort of trundle it through the woods and frighten the enemy, or try to. And if you read the story, it actually sounds, like I said, eerily like the Flatwoods monster story, which surfaced just a few years after the war. So, you have to wonder, was the Flatwoods monster actually a real alien event? Or was it Jasper Maskelyne's 12-foot tall scarecrow type thing, sort of putting the fear of God into anybody on the other side who happened to come across it?
So do you think that the possibility that our military or some psychological warfare division was probably out there in West Virginia just like testing this thing to see what the reaction they could get out of people?
Well, I mean, in relation to the answers to that question, what's interesting is that the locations where Maskelyne said the testing went ahead, he said what they basically did to ensure that not too many people found out, that so they would perform these experiments on the fringes of like little towns and villages that were surrounded by forests and woods, where most people, no one else would know about it. And Flatwoods is like a very little rural West Virginia town surrounded by hills and, massive forests. And that's exactly the sort of location where Maskelyne tested his 12-foot tall robotic thing. So in that sense, yes, I think we could make a case that they were watching both areas. But I have to admit as well, the idea of a 12-foot tall, clunking, glowing-eyed scarecrow being pushed down the roads of some, little town in the US,
right.
That sounds almost as bizarre as the idea that the Flatwoods monster was really an alien, So I have to admit, I think it can still go both ways. But
yeah.
But, it is a very weird story.
Well, that's the thing. It's like you we're saying that it is bizarre, but there are so many bizarre ideas.
Yeah.
And one of them was another one that I want to mention, too, is this, and this never got off the ground, thankfully, and I think this is part of our Operation Northwoods. I may be incorrect about that, but this whole idea to, like, stage the rapture in Cuba.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's another example where in the early 1960s, when in relation to Cuba, and Fidel Castro was perceived by the CIA as being the next big threat, and so they thought of all these different ways to get rid of Cuba. And, there were these famous or infamous stories of, China give him an exploding cigar. He loves these cigars.
Make his hair fall out, stuff like that.
Yeah, make his hair fall out, and the cigar would blow his head off or whatever. But the strangest plan that sort of semi got off the road, but really didn't take off fully, and that was an operation that the CIA created where the plan was to fake a second coming of Jesus in the skies over Cuba. And the plan, basically, which was run by a guy named Major General Edward Lansdale, he was the guy who actually ran this program. And he wrote, after his retirement, he wrote a couple of books about his experiences, which are sort of really intriguing and almost like jaw-dropping, some of these bizarre stories that he got involved in. But with this one, the plan was to fly aircraft in the clouds over Cuba, in small aircraft that would have their engines muffled, and there would be these huge, powerful microphones that were basically, or essentially sort of broadcast the voice of Jesus, but it would actually be the voice of CIA agents saying essentially, renounce communism, renounce Castro, and embrace the United States. And on top of that, they also had, U.S. intelligence also brought in scientists and technicians who could, in essence, project images of Jesus on the clouds. And this would sort of tie in time-wise with these extremely loud sort of loudspeakers and microphones broadcasting the voice of what actually was not Jesus.
Well, they got Orson Welles or somebody to do the voice of Jesus? Is that what would happen?
Well, yeah, what happened was eventually the whole thing was cancelled because they couldn't guarantee that the clouds would be thick enough at the right time. They couldn't make sure that, the sounds from the engines of the aircraft wouldn't be muffled out enough. And so it was actually cancelled. But it does demonstrate the sheer extent that some of these experiments went to. I mean, another one, in the very early years of the Cold War, we're talking about 1947, 48, when the Russians were becoming the big problem after the Nazis. Well, the Germans began to sort of seed these rumors and stories that they had got agents all across the U.S. who had smuggled atomic bombs into the U.S., and that like New York, L.A., Las Vegas, Boston, Dallas, that atomic bombs had been carefully and secretly placed in all these U.S. cities and maybe even more, and that at one point they were all going to be detonated at the same time. Now, thankfully, this didn't happen for two reasons. One, because it wasn't true that the Russians had never had the ability to, sort of secretly get into the United States with atomic bombs and place them, in like 10 or 12 cities. But what happened was that the FBI got really worried and disturbed about this, and they spent literally years trying to track this story down and trying to figure out where these bombs were. And it turned out there were no bombs. There were no agents who'd infiltrated the U.S. The whole point was to direct the FBI from legitimate intelligence-based programs and have them chasing these fabricated tales of atomic bombs. So, again, there's a lot of weird stuff going on that involves plausible scenarios that actually turned out to be complete lies, but driven by the idea to try and freak out the mindset of the enemy.
Because all you got to do in psychological warfare is just like sow that seed of doubt.
Yeah.
That's all you really have to do. And one of there is, I think, a good case of actual, when I just thought of this, was of using religion and psychological warfare. I mean, that's the Phoenix program and the Wandering Soul recordings in Vietnam.
Oh yeah, I mean, the Vietnam War was sort of ripe again for this kind of thing. Just trying to find ways to, affect the mindset of the North Koreans. And one of the things they did was to leave playing cards of the Ace of Spades around the bodies of the North Korean soldiers who were killed, because that was sort of perceived as like a supernatural kind of threat almost. So a lot of effort went into sort of altering the mindsets of whole swathes of people, just as a means to try and create a sense of fear out of something that, if they'd looked further, they would have found didn't actually really exist. But it was just the thought of it all.
Yeah.
I can remember. This has nothing to do with Russia, but I remember, because I live just outside of Dallas, that just a few years ago, when there was an outbreak of, oh God, what was it?
Ebola.
Ebola.
Yeah, it was like 3 people.
That's right. Yeah, and it was like in the whole Dallas area, and within literally days, people were saying that Dallas needs to be cordoned off, and be placed under sort of emergency situation. It was almost like The Walking Dead come to life, you know what I mean? Like, the city's got to be blocked off, that kind of thing. And that had nothing to do with the Russians, I should stress, but what it did demonstrate was how quickly hysteria and fear got whipped up because of this whole Ebola thing in Dallas. And I followed this locally, obviously, because I live just outside the outskirts of Dallas, and it really was, kind of like martial law, contain the cities, don't let anyone in, don't let anyone out, otherwise the whole country's going to go down. And then it died off in a few weeks' time, and then everybody forgot about it and turned their attentions to American Idol or whatever.
And so the same way that we found utility, especially in manipulating the remnants of religious belief in the communist world, you argue that they really they were able to use the UFO phenomenon and the contactee movement to try to manipulate us in the same way.
Well, yeah, this is where, I guess, in the book, the story kind of really kicks off. Now, the whole sort of modern era, if you like, or it's not so modern now, though, but, the modern era of ufology largely sort of kicked off in the summer of 1947 with the Kenneth Arnold encounter over Washington State in June 1947. I think Arnold basically said these objects he saw flew like a saucer would fly if you skipped it across a body of water. And that's actually how the term flying saucer was created. It was actually nothing to do with the shape. It was the way they kind of, like you would bounce a pebble across water, when you're playing in a pool of water when you're a kid, that kind of thing. And so the Russians realized that here was a subject, a mystery, that was really intriguing the U.S. public and the media and the military. And so they thought, well, maybe we can use this in the same way they kind of used this bogus atomic bomb story. And so what we find is a number of the early contactees, people who said they were in contact with very human-looking aliens in the early 50s, and who claimed that they wanted us all to lay down our nuclear weapons and so on. A lot of the contactees said that at least some of these so-called space brothers, as they were known, kind of like Michael Rennie's role in The Day the Earth Stood Still, like sort of benign aliens who want to help us. Well, it turned out that a lot of the early contactees who were put in these sort of positions said that the aliens they met and who wanted us to lay down our weapons and live in peace, a lot of the contactees said the aliens they met had communist-type governments,
right,
and a sort of state of life, if you like. And one of the ones who really promoted this sort of the aliens are communist angles was George Adamski, who was one of the most famous, if not the most famous, of all the contactees. And now his first book that came out, it was co-written with a guy named Desmond Leslie in 1953. When that book came out, it sold in the region of about 125,000 copies, which is a hell of a lot of books to sell on UFOs. And basically what happened was that not only was his book selling, as I said, in six figures, Adamski, but also he was sort of getting massive audiences at his lectures and conferences, and he was also spelling this story out of, the Russians are communists and communism is good. Now, if the FBI, who followed Adamski very closely, if the FBI found out that Adamski, his book had sold 5 copies and he was just telling it to sort of 7 or 8 people on a Sunday afternoon in a library with, 5 people and somebody's cat and dog, the FBI wouldn't have cared.
Yeah.
But the fact that he, his first book sold 125,000 copies, and he was speaking about how communism was good and the aliens are communists.
Right.
That's when the FBI got really concerned. And that's why they opened an extensive surveillance file on George Adamski, which has now been declassified by the FBI. They've placed it in the public domain now. And it actually runs to just under 400 pages.
Jeez.
That shows the sheer extent that the FBI followed just about every word that Adamski said. And one of the big concerns was that because Adamski was saying that, yes, the aliens were communists, the FBI were worried that Adamski was, although he was living in the US, the fear was that he was being sort of hired by the Russians to specifically claim that, the aliens were communists and to try and spread it more and more. So, the Russians kind of had this, I hate to say it, but, they were sort of a little bit ahead of us when it came to, trying to affect the mindset of the Russians. They were onto it much quicker in terms of trying to sort of affect the Western mindset.
When you have that idea of determinism in Marxism and this, going towards a futuristic society would be, in our conceptions, a post scarcity society. So naturally it kind of, lends itself to some kind of super organized state system or something like that.
Yeah, it's Star Trek, the Federation, basically. Everything's taken care of.
So in the backdrop of the Cold War, while we had God on our side, they had the Space Brothers.
Yeah. And Adamski,
Space Comrades.
Adamski too. I mean,
Exactly.
he made comments. Flat out comments, as you point out in the book, that he actually said Russia will dominate the world.
Yep, that's what he said. Yeah, and but he was lucky not to get sort of arrested for sort of dissent or something like that. But I think the FBI's mindset was not to sort of reel him in and arrest him and say, why are you saying this? I think the approach they took, well, I know the approach they took was basically to just carefully and closely watch him, to see who he was talking to, but more importantly, who was talking to him. And there are rumors or stories in the files about Adamski having been seen in downtown LA, because he lived in California. He'd been seen in LA actually talking to Russian people. Now, who those Russian people were, we don't know, and the files don't fully explain who they were either. But the files do make it clear that these rumors were flying around that Adamski had Russian sort of cohorts buried somewhere deep in Los Angeles.
It's interesting to me that Adamski as a Pole would be so cozy with the Russians because, especially at that time, there's not a lot of love between the two.
Well, yeah, you're right. One of the people I spoke to while I was writing the book, and who very generously shared his time, was a guy named Colin Bennett, who wrote a book all about Adamski and his experiences. And unfortunately, excuse me, but Colin died just a few years ago. But he generously gave me an interview, and he came to believe that in relation to this whole situation, when you talk about that being a Pole, that he wouldn't be sort of very open to Russia and so on. Colin felt that what Adamski was doing was trying in a very skewed way to try and bring the world together under one government. Mm-hmm. But he crossed the line by making that one government communist,
Right, yeah.
Well, he might have been a communist and anti-Soviet also, though.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the sort of difficult parts of this story, sort of, 60 years later, trying to put the whole picture together. But Colin did believe that Adamski felt, regardless if he was lying or creating stories, he felt that if he could achieve a goal for the better good, it was worth lying and spreading bogus stories. That's so. In other words, he wasn't like a faking for money or fame. He was faking to try and prevent the world, as he saw it, from ending up in like a nuclear inferno, that kind of thing.
So let's talk about Orfeo Angelucci, because this is super interesting. I mean, here's another contactee, and I think the thought is here the possibility that he was also being investigated, and there's some maybe like little mind control things going on with this.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the story of Orfeo Angelucci is in many ways even more sort of astounding and weird than the tales of George Adamski. Now, there's no doubt that Adamski was sort of the primary one of all the contactees. He was number one, and then there was sort of George Van Tassel and George Hunt Williamson. I don't know why the aliens tended to pick up on Georges all the time, but apparently
George King was the other one.
Yeah, George King, of the Theory of Society. Yeah. But that is kind of like one of the weird things that so many of the contactees were named George. But but anyway. But then you had this sort of second level of the contactees who were well known on the the lecture circuit. They'd written a couple of books, but they weren't anywhere near the scale of Adamski. They might be selling 200 copies of their books at this conference and 50 at that one, and that was the scenario. Now, Orfeo Angelucci was someone who was also sort of approached in like a Soviet fashion, so to speak, when he started to get bigger and bigger, and he became more and more visible and well known on the lecture circuit, and particularly so out at Giant Rock in California. Now, Giant Rock is just outside the town of Landers in California, not too far from Joshua Tree.
Yeah, I got to go there about a year or so ago with
cool.
Greg Bishop and Walter Bosley took me out there.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, Greg's a good friend of mine, and excuse me, and Walter as well. And that they know the area and the history, sort of like the back of their hand. But yeah, the whole scenario, sort of the contactees, took up massively when George Van Tassel began to put on these regular events out at Giant Rock. And for people who don't know, the area is called Giant Rock because it's dominated by this huge hulking giant rock, and that's where Van Tassel said that he had his encounters with the aliens. Now, Orfeo Angelucci was invited regularly to speak at the Giant Rock events. Now, if you go to a UFO gig today, you're probably going to get somewhere between 300 to maybe 500 on a good day in terms of audience numbers. That's sort of pretty much the amount. Back in the 50s, out at Giant Rock every year, George Van Tassel got figures in the approximate number of about 11,000. Now,
yeah, it was kind of like Burning Man of its day, in a way.
Yeah, I kind of describe it as like a cross between Burning Man and Lollapalooza. That's the best way I can describe it. It's sort of like It was lectures and speeches from the speakers, from the contactees, but it was also just like a meeting of friends and minds, and everybody would come in the cars and hang out and bring food and drinks, and there'd be people telling about their experiences, but also it was more sort of like a get together. There were people playing music and things like this, and so you can make a good case. It was like a cross, like Burning Man and Lollapalooza, that kind of thing.
Sounds like the Strange Realities Conference coming up here in Nashville.
Yeah, maybe so. That's right.
Minus about 10,000 something people.
Yeah. But what happened was that just like Adamski, Angelucci found himself on several occasions approached by what he described as people with foreign accents and who kind of really put the heat on him and basically said, we want you to keep telling the stories that you're telling, but we also want you to put like a communist spin on who the aliens are and why they're coming here and why communism is so great. Now, unlike Adamski, who went straight into it, Angelucci sort of said, not just no, but hell no. And he actually contacted the FBI and said, these people have contacted me on several occasions when I've been lecturing, and this was particularly going on not just at Giant Rock, but when he was speaking on the East Coast of the US at various conferences and events. And he said, I'm very worried that these people are communists or they're Russians, and they're trying to force me to slant my stories around communism. And the FBI, they opened a file on Angelucci, but it was not a file like Adamski where the FBI was sort of like pissed by Adamski, they just loathed him. But with Angelucci, they were actually appreciative of the fact that he'd approached them and told them. So they did open a file on him, but it was for, like a very different reason to Adamski. Now, what happened was that he would have these visits, or these people would come up to him now and again and warn him in this sort of, like a, quote, friendly threat, that kind of thing. The sort of offer you can't, say no to. Angelucci fell. On one occasion, out at 20 Pines out in California, one particular night, he went to a diner there, sat down, and this guy turned up, sat opposite him, looked very human, nothing strange about him at all, but introduced him as someone who knew exactly who Angelucci was. And this guy, who used the name of Adam, which almost certainly was just like an alias or something. And this guy, Adam said, I can help you. I can tell you all the answers that you need about UFOs and your encounters. But to do so, you've got to take this pill first. It's kind of like the classic scene in The Matrix. Do you take the blue pill or the red pill?
Right.
And that was kind of the quandary that Angelucci was in. And in the year, I should say, over the years, I've done some stupid things, but I've never actually swallowed a pill from someone I don't know, and I've no idea what the thing is.
Usually not a good idea.
I have done some stupid things, but that wasn't one of them. And but what's interesting is that Angelucci said that very shortly after he took this pill, which he just swallowed, he just chugged it down with a drink, within about 15 minutes he started to feel kind of weird and just strange. And then he said the room itself, the colours in the diner became more and more vibrant. And then he said he could see like this little ballerina dancing in a glass on the table. So he'd clearly been hit by something, whether it was something like LSD or whatever it was. It's important to know this was the exact time frame when the CIA was working on its MKULTRA mind control and mind manipulation programs.
Right.
And the more and more that Angelucci got plunged into this sort of spaced out, screwed up situation, he began to realize, before he got sort of full blown into this, strange state of mind, he realized that this guy, Adam, was far less interested in essentially, telling Angelucci what the aliens wanted and so on, but it was more along the lines of this guy Adam was asking Angelucci all about his experiences, and in this sort of trippy state, Angelucci just reeled it all off. These guys met me, they met me here, they met me there, they asked me to say this, they got me to say that. And what's interesting is that all the time this guy Adam was interrogating Angelucci while he was in this drug state, there were two U.S. soldiers essentially just sitting at the next table, staring intently at both of them, almost as if, they were sort of just watching the situation in case it turned badly, and he overdosed or freaked out or whatever. But what's particularly notable is because when I first learned, if you like, of Angelucci's story, and the time frame, it sort of really struck me, well, this was like some sort of MKUltra kind of thing, this had nothing to do with aliens. And I tried to get hold of the FBI file on Angelucci. Now, as I said, the FBI have released the Adamski file, which is just over 400 pages of surveillance papers. And Van Tassel's file, I think, is 398 pages or 397. So that's pushing 400. Albert Bender's was like 70. George Hunt Williams was about 80 or 90. And so, and I managed to get...
investigated all these guys.
All of them were being watched. And I managed to get all those files. The only one I could not get was the Angelucci file. And the FBI has now gone on record as saying that they actually destroyed the Angelucci file in 2009. Now, that's not hearsay or rumor. That's in writing. They said, well, we destroyed it, back in 2009. So unless there was a second copy made, we'll never really know what the Angelucci file said. But there's no doubt in my mind that even if he had genuine UFO encounters, which ironically I actually think he did.
Right.
I think he did have real experiences.
Right.
But
same here.
It was kind of tainted by the fact that the whole MKUltra aspect and fabrication and hypnosis was brought into it as well. And so, the whole thing becomes like a really strange scenario of, mind-controlled interrogation to try and find out if the aliens really are communists,
So basically, they pretty much roofied him, and then secondly, they're using it as a form of like truth serum to get this information from him. Yeah.
Yes, I mean,
whatever it was.
Yeah, that's actually one of the very interesting parts of the FBI's involvement. They weren't really writing off what the contactees were saying. I mean, if you read the files on, like, particularly Van Tassel, the files talk about how, the aliens were sort of described by the FBI in their files in a very matter-of-fashion style. It wasn't like, this man's a liar, and, we need to sort of go over there and warn him to stop what he's doing. It was more along the lines of, well, this is what he said, and he thinks this and he thinks that. And it really was like a down-to-earth, matter-of-fact style. So they were quite open to the idea of that these people were telling the truth. But what concerned the FBI was the political aspect of all this and how politics could impact on ufology. And in a worst-case scenario, not just politics, but Russian politics as well.
Let's get to a couple of... because I want to talk about the MJ-12 stuff, but before we do that, I want to get to the Project Serpo documents.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because that in and of itself, and this is later, I mean, this is after the fall of the Soviet Union, but there could be some connection to the Serpo material and possibly to some kind of disinformation campaign coming over from Russia.
Well, yeah, I mean, for people who are not fully aware of the Serpo story, it goes back actually more than a decade now, and it purportedly talks about a real-life version of what we call like the final scenes of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when you have this group of astronauts all going off to a faraway world, and there's like a group of aliens who come out this massive UFO, and they stay here, that kind of thing. So Serpo is very much like, the final stages of Close Encounters, and the theory is that possibly, the government may have sort of impacted on the production even of Close Encounters. Now, it was sort of 10 years or so thereabouts when the whole Serpo story surfaced with these documents, controversial documents, because they weren't officially declassified. It was almost like an Edward Snowden scenario. Somebody on the inside had supposedly leaked these documents about these American astronauts sent to this faraway world, and then they come back and some of them are dead and some have gone insane and just could not, deal with being on another world, with other beings and things like that. And very strange situation. Now, at one point, when the whole Serpo thing was at its height, a guy surfaced who claimed to have worked in the British Ministry of Defence in the late 1960s, and he said that he knew that the documents were real in the sense that they were created by both British and US intelligence working together. But he said, although the documents were real, the story that the documents told was not real. In other words, that they really did have like the CIA and MI6 in the UK putting these files together, that they really did create them, but they were fabricated, they didn't tell a real story. And this guy who said that he worked for British intelligence said that the actual person who wrote the Serpo documents was a woman named Alice Bradley Sheldon. Now, Alice Bradley Sheldon, her husband as well, were both employed in the 1950s and 60s by the CIA, and both of them got involved in all sorts of espionage operations and spying programs and things like that. But the important thing is that as well as being a CIA officer, Alice Bradley Sheldon was also a sci-fi writer, and she wrote under the alias of a guy named James Tiptree, and that was basically the scenario. You have this woman, Alice Bradley Sheldon, who was a sci-fi writer and an employee of the CIA. She would have been arguably the best person, to sort of create or concoct is probably a better term, these documents. When you've got a CIA case officer who happens to write science fiction about aliens, the story is that she was hired to write these documents as a means to frighten the Russians into thinking that we had done a deal with aliens. Now, what's particularly intriguing, you mentioned the Majestic 12 documents earlier. Well, both Alice Bradley Sheldon and her husband both died in May 1987, which was the very same moment when the original MJ-12 documents surfaced.
That is
what
strange.
happened? Well, what happened was that both Alice Bradley Sheldon and her husband were in bad health, and one night she shot him in the head while he was sleeping, and then she killed herself. But, I do find it interesting that the time frame was literally within days of when the MJ-12 documents first went public. So it makes me wonder, if she did that as a means to try and prevent, the whole MJ12 and Serpo thing coming out, because I do wonder if she did create the MJ12 documents as a means to try and, affect the Russians, or maybe she wrote the MJ12 documents as well. So, but then you have, as I talk about in the book, you also have U.S. intelligence who, for a while, thought that the MJ12 documents were the work of the KGB.
Right.
Or maybe it was a combination. This is where things kind of get really sort of strange and, going up in different strands and angles.
Well, I guess let's dive into Majestic 12 then.
Yeah, because this gets really convoluted.
I think my first exposure was through Bill Cooper's book.
Yeah, and I've seen some of them because Peter Robbins has them. He's got some, he's got them like in binders in his house, and I've looked through some of them.
Oh wow.
Well, I guess for people who may not be familiar with it, though most people into ufology probably are, but can we give a basic background on the different sets of these and how they're all kind of related?
The MJ12 documents, you mean?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, for people who don't know, I'm sure most people in ufology and most people listening have heard of the MJ12 documents or the Majestic 12 documents, however you want to put it. And it all goes back really to the late 1970s. And this is when Charles Berlitz and Bill Moore started to, and Stan Friedman, the three of them started to dig further and further into the Roswell story. Now, although Roswell occurred in 1947, it had largely been forgotten until the mid to late 70s, when Stan Friedman and Bill Moore started to look into it more, and they started to sort of pool all their efforts together to try and figure out, did an alien craft and the bodies, crash down at Roswell. And by 1979, the amount of data collected by Stan and by Bill Moore was enough to finally put a book together. And in 1980, the Roswell incident, which was co-written between Bill Moore and Charles Berlitz, was published, and Stan got like a big acknowledgement for allowing his work to be used. Now, in the wake of the publication of the Roswell incident, Bill Moore started to get weird calls and communications from people in the intelligence community who wanted to meet with him. And over the next few years through to the early to mid-80s, Bill was approached by various figures, very often like old guys who sort of came across like, sort of long-time people working in the intelligence community, and they would share with him controversial documents about UFOs and aliens that could have been the real deal. They might not have been. We don't know. But the most significant collection surfaced in the mailbox of a guy named Jamie Chandray. And Jamie Chandray was a friend and colleague of Bill Moore. They were working together after Berlitz left it all behind. And they looked into it further and further. And one particular day, there was this sound of like, the mailbox being opened. And so Chandray went to the door, and there was this manila-type envelope. They opened it, and there was like a collection of negatives of what looked like documents. So they essentially printed the pictures off and dug into it. And the documents talked about this super secret group within the U.S. government called Majestic 12, or for sort of, in abbreviated form, MJ12. And supposedly it was a group of high-ranking people in the military, the government, the intelligence community, whose job it was to hide the truth of Roswell and alien autopsies and UFO crashes, all this kind of thing. And so in 1987, Timothy Good, an English researcher and ufologist, had also obtained some of these documents under circumstances which 32 years later we still don't know how Tim got those copies. But Stan, Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray were very concerned that if they didn't go public now, then Tim would blow the whistle and get all the acclaim and so on. So what happened was that Stan, Jamie, and Bill put out their copies of the documents, and then shortly after, Tim Good put out his copies in his May 1987 book, Above Top Secret. Now, the big question is, of course, like with the Serpo documents, and even like those Russian plans and documents in the late 40s about bogus atomic bombs, placed in different places in the United States. The big question was, are these the real deal? Now, a lot of people in ufology bought into the MJ12 documents. I mean, Stan Friedman, Stan to his dying day, just a few months back, Stan was a full-on believer in the MJ12 documents. And although me and Stan, disagreed on this, again, right up, to the last time I saw him, which was in January 2019, even though we disagreed, I remember we had like a really fun day just chatting, not even about UFOs. And I'm glad, I kind of had that last chat with him, But Stan was someone who you could disagree with him, but you could also sit around and talk about just anything else beyond UFOs as well. And so, Stan was a full-on believer in MJ12. Now, Jamie and Bill, they wrote their own report in 1990 where they admitted, they weren't sure if the documents were real or not. But what's particularly notable is that when the documents surfaced and they were perceived as being like sort of fake, as being documents that had been perhaps stolen, and or that they'd been leaked again by like an Edward Snowden type. When this story got out, the FBI opened an investigation because they were concerned that despite the sensational nature of the documents, the FBI was still concerned that these documents, if they were real, had been released unofficially, illegally. Kind of like, again, like Snowden, leaking all these documents. It was sort of that scenario. Now, the FBI came to three different theories. One, well, they may be real, The other one was the idea that they were not real, but it was the idea of somebody's hoax. Or the third scenario was the idea that the documents were created by what used to be in Russia, in the Soviet Union, the KGB, which doesn't actually exist now, but it has, it's been replaced. And when they looked further and further into the issue of MJ12 and the KGB potentially having a connection, what the FBI found was that there were, now this is listed in the Freedom of Information documents, but names, what I'm going to say now, names aren't mentioned in the documents, they're deleted. But the documents talk about how in the late 70s and through the 80s, there were a number of people working in the field of top secret US Air Force and aerospace programs, but who also had a deep interest in UFOs. And the theory the FBI had was that the FBI was concerned that the Russians, the KGB, would approach these people who were working in aerospace programs in the US and who also had an interest in UFOs. The FBI was concerned that the Russians would approach these American citizens and say, basically, look, we'll give you these MJ12 documents which talk all about Roswell, all the things you want to hear, and in return, you'll give us information on the US stealth bomber and the stealth fighter. So it was kind of like a classic dangling carrot kind of situation. You do something for us, we'll do something for you. And of course, the actual goal of the Russians was to get as much from US intelligence about the stealth fighter and the stealth bomber, and in return, these people in the US would get just bogus MJ12 documents. And so that was one of the primary aspects of the MJ12 scenario. Now, for people who might think, well, no, the MJ12 documents are the real deal, one of the things I should stress is that I managed to get quite a few of pages of the FBI's file on MJ12, and the file is not, as you might expect, titled something like leaked document or potentially leaked document, that kind of thing. The file on MJ12 that the FBI has is actually titled espionage, so, which is to do with spying. So I think a good case can be made.
That's telling.
Yeah, I think to some degree at least, the Russians were involved in MJ12 and in creating fabricated documents as a means to try and reel people in who might be able to, in return for being given the MJ12 documents, would donate, if you like, that's the right term to use, information on the stealth fighter and the stealth bomber before they were actually, unveiled on the runways and whatever.
Well, is that because people in aerospace naturally would be some of the most interested in this advanced aerospace technology? So it was like, I wonder if in addition to this possible operation, if there were others that targeted people involved in aerospace by using the UFO phenomenon. It seems like it'd be
it would appeal to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I'm sure that somebody who is in the aerospace business, and there are these documents being offered by the Russians about, highly advanced technological power systems from some other world. Some of them just may have gone for it, and just could not resist the lure of, well, okay, yeah, we'll give you this, but I want those MJ12 documents, and that was the FBI's theory, if you like. The idea that the Russians were sort of just trying to reel people in, and the only thing they were going to give the people in the US was fabricated documents. Now, people might say, well, that just can't be, or they may not like the theory because it goes against their belief systems. But one thing I can say, it actually does make sense,
Absolutely. Then you also talk about the Soviets using the idea that UFOs are in fact Soviet as a way of demonstrating the superiority of Soviet technology also.
Yeah, that was one of the other angles as well. If the Russians have got spacecraft, flying saucers, UFOs that can, sort of travel at 5,000 miles an hour and do left and right-hand turns without stopping, and, they can blast aircraft out of the sky, it doesn't really matter if the Russians had developed that kind of... Well, it does matter if they did develop that kind of technology. But the fact is, even if they hadn't got that technology, just the fear that they had that technology would be plenty enough to just seed, to sow the seeds of fear that, oh my God, maybe the Russians really are behind the UFO phenomenon. They've had this technology for so many years, and, if it ever comes to a full-on war situation, we could end up wiped out. Which
they'll send the flying saucers
happened.
over. Yeah.
And then, in addition to that, we may have been trying to perpetuate a myth that we are in contact with the aliens receiving secret technology that makes our military capability superior to them.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it was kind of like, sort of when you're a kid and, so my dad's bigger and more stronger than your dad,
Space brothers are better friends with me than you.
Yeah, exactly. I think what it comes down to is that each side was just doing what they felt they had to do to essentially create fear, hysteria, and paranoia on the part of the other side. And the bigger that somebody came up with one scenario, the other side has to counter it with an even bigger scenario. And I think that's why so many of these stories became so controversial and bizarre, because to achieve the goal, they just had to keep going and going,
Yeah, it's the ultimate form of psychological warfare. What you're doing is you just on a mass scale.
Yeah.
There's some weirdness too with the Majestic 12 documents that you talk about in the book, and that's this strange connection that has nothing to do with UFOs, but this whole strange connection to like the AIDS conspiracy theory that it was manufactured by the United States and all this, but somehow that ends up in the Majestic 12 documents.
Yeah, well, this is probably the most controversial part of the whole book. It's important to note there were sort of three levels of the release of the MJ12 documents. You had, in the 1980s, you had the initial MJ12 documents, which surfaced to Bill Moore, Stan Friedman, and Jamie Chandray, and which Tim Good, as I said, under circumstances we don't really know, got his copies as well. That was the 1980s. Just a couple of years ago, there was another group of documents that surfaced, but the other group, the third group, that really caught just about everybody's attention, surfaced in the early to mid 1990s, and they were documents that were given to a guy named Timothy Cooper, who at the time lived at Big Bear Lake, California. Now, Tim was someone who, very different scenario and situation, because whereas Bill Moore and Stan Friedman got documents in the figure of like 7 or 8 pages, Tim Cooper actually got documents in the number, all collectively, of about 1,500 pages. And many of them written in very different typewriters and styles, demonstrating that multiple typewriters have been used, which kind of suggests that, unless Cooper went out and, spent a ton of money on a dozen or so of vintage typewriters, which I don't believe he did. I don't believe he was, the faker here, but he did get his hands on a massive amount of documents. Now, this part of the story actually ties to me, as I point in the book, that Tim Cooper received this sort of 1,000, 1,500 pages of documents all about MJ12 and alien autopsies, this kind of thing. He got them between the very early part of the 1990s and he quit ufology in 2002. Now, one of the people who was really interested in the MJ12 documents was a ufologist named Dr. Bob Wood. And it turns out that Tim sold all of his MJ12 documents to Bob Wood. And Bob Wood, in 2002, hired me to spend about a week or so in a motel in Orange County, California, to go through all of the MJ12 documents that Cooper got. And some of them that I got access to have never, ever been placed into the public domain. And so it was like a weird... I kind of, in the book, I sort of parallel it between where, like in Hunter S. Thompson's book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, he's hunkered up in this hotel room, trying to write this story in Las Vegas. That's kind of what I was doing, I was sort of holed up in a motel room in Orange County with like 1,500 pages of alleged classified documents on MJ12. And
you get a bit paranoid?
No, it was kind of cool, really. I had like it was arranged where the one of the staff would come every so often. It would be like, I get a bunch of sandwiches and a bunch of beer and just going through all the documents.
Oh, that's awesome, dude. That's a dream come true.
So it was, that was a cool and almost like surreal kind of situation, really. But what was interesting, but also disturbing, and what was very different to all the other MJ12 documents, is that the papers that Tim Cooper got talked about in a number of examples where supposedly the aliens that had been found on, like at Roswell and different places around New Mexico in the 40s, supposedly some of the technicians and personnel who got close to the craft and close to these pulverized alien bodies suddenly started to fall ill and sick under like incredibly fast times. and it was described as like a blood-borne virus that could get into the human bloodstream, and it could cause like a worldwide plague, and indeed the description of this alien virus was actually not at all dissimilar to the whole issue of like HIV and AIDS, and how HIV can cause death if you don't have the right the right medication and so on. Now, what's intriguing is that at the very same time that when Cooper started to get his MJ12 documents, this was when, we know now, this is a fact, that the Russians, the KGB, in the mid through the late 80s, through the very early 90s, started to spread rumors that the AIDS virus, HIV, was created by the US government to essentially use it as like a bacteriological warfare scenario. Now, this was complete bullshit. This was garbage. The US government did not create AIDS and the HIV as a means to try and lower the population numbers, but that was the theory that the KGB spread across the country, and it's intriguing to find that at the very same time the KGB was spreading rumors that the United States had created HIV, this was the same time when Cooper was getting these documents talking about an alien virus that could wipe out the human race, but which the US government wanted to try and weaponize, and it was described as this blood-borne virus with characteristics very similar to HIV. So that's one of the things I talk about in the book, is how, from my perspective, almost certainly the Cooper documents and all these parallels with HIV, I'm pretty sure that this was a follow-on from the Russians and the KGB's plans to try and convince people that HIV was created by the US government, and it appears to be, at least, that this is what the Russians did. They continued this scenario and applied this issue of fabricated viruses. They applied it to the UFO phenomenon as well.
That's fascinating, and that's something that didn't really take off as much in the conspiracy realm, it seems, the alien AIDS angle. It just kind of stuck to the government. Right. But the fact that was going on simultaneously, that's fascinating.
Nick, are there any instances that you can think of that's going on now, since we're, obviously the Russians are incredibly active now. So in the UFO field, do you think that there's any Russian collusion, Russian meddling going on now?
Well, I actually do, but I think one of the problems with the field of ufology is that so many people don't want to know or don't want to deal with the idea that a lot of the the established UFO lore, so to speak, LORE rather than LAW, the law of ufology, a lot of people just don't want it disrupted because, frankly, a lot of the stories are exciting and they're cool to listen to, and people don't want to hear that. But in terms of it still going on, there's no doubt about this. And one of the examples goes back to Edward Snowden. Now, I guess I should say first, different people have different views on Snowden and what he did, and etc. Different people see him as like a traitor, other people see him as a whistleblower, and so on. So, but regardless of how you perceive and view Snowden, the fact is that in the summer of 2013, when he went public with all this massive amounts of documentation talking about NSA surveillance and things like this, well, one of the particular documents that was released by Cooper, by Snowden, was titled, I'm quoting the title now, "How Covert Agents Infiltrate the Internet to manipulate, deceive, and destroy reputations. Now, that was the title of a document, but also the title of what was essentially like a lecture given on behalf of the NSA and also GCHQ, the government headquarters in the UK, which is the GCHQ is the UK equivalent of the NSA. And we don't have the audio, unfortunately, of this lecture that was, as I said, was titled "How Covert Agents Infiltrate the Internet to Manipulate, Deceive, and Destroy Reputations." Now, what we do know is because the lecture was actually filmed, and the PowerPoint actually shows throughout the lecture a number of images of UFOs. So this, if you look at the title, which deals with manipulation, deception, and destroying reputations on the internet, this clearly makes it obvious that, surveillance and attempts to try and affect the reputations of people in ufology have clearly gone on. And, just the very fact that this is a legitimate document, even though we don't have the audio, it does demonstrate that, sort of counterintelligence and psychological warfare is still being used to this day in relation to UFOs.
Absolutely. And I'd say they probably took a few pages out of our book as far as manipulating religion.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think what all this kind of comes down to is that it's so easy to manipulate people. I mean, like that whole thing I mentioned with Ebola. I mean, that just took off immediately. And like I said, living down just outside, I live like about 20 minutes drive from where President Kennedy was shot, so I know Dallas like the back of my hand. And when that whole Ebola thing came out and, there were people, Dallas, were going down with Ebola, I mean, it really was kind of like, sort of Rick Grimes and Daryl, you know what I mean? it really was. People were saying, let's block off the roads and all this kind of stuff. And, and people were saying, in a quite actually real situation, that Ebola actually exists in the human body for days after the person's dead. It actually, the person remains a biological threat after death for several days. That is a fact. And so, but you had this almost Walking Dead type scenario. And it doesn't, what the book demonstrates, it doesn't take much to provoke and create hysteria in terms of affecting people's mindsets and belief systems, and as to how chillingly easy, people can be persuaded by this or by that.
Right. Yeah, and you saw that definitely with the Russian meddling on Facebook and social media.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they really appealed. Yeah. They really appealed to religion, and they really appealed to like the sense of fear, and they really appealed to the sense of panic that was permeating, and that's I think that really these tactics. I mean, it's just basic psychological warfare.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see this in so many different aspects, I guess. I mean, although I primarily, focus in the book on UFOs, as I mentioned, there was this thing that really got the FBI worried about, that there was possibly 10 or 12 atomic bombs strategically situated in U.S. cities, all primed to go off together on one day. And it was nothing to it at all. I mean, another example I briefly mentioned in the book was that the Russians spread stories in the late 40s that I guess the equivalent of terrorists today had infected the U.S. cattle herd, and that people were going to fall sick and ill due to some deadly virus which was in the cow herds, and which, beef is very, a popular foodstuff, and that they would go down with it as well. And again, there was nothing to that, but the Russians figured out that, a lot of beef gets eaten in the United States. Well, let's create a scenario where everybody's going to fall ill due to a deadly virus through eating beef.
Oh, well, I wonder if I just wonder if maybe that fed into some of the cattle mutilation stuff too.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I debated as to whether or not I should do a chapter on the book. On that subject in the book, I should say. But I didn't actually get round to it. But I actually did wonder, if there was a connection, and if it should be brought up in the book. But maybe I'll sort of address that further and sort of lengthier to another day. But yeah, you could make a case that if there was a belief that the Russians had infiltrated basically the entire cattle herd, you could understand why possibly things like black helicopters would be flying around and checking the cattle out just to make sure the Russians hadn't actually, affected them with viruses. But this sort of ties in similarly. With me growing up in England, the whole mad cow disease. When that kicked off in the 80s, again, there were these sort of apocalyptic stories, that the UK is going to have to be kind of, just quarantined. Again, sort of playing with movies and TV shows. Some of the stuff that was flying around in the 80s when I was a kid living out in the UK, it was kind of like, you remember 28 Days Later when the UK gets quarantined by the rage virus, and you remember that?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, in that movie, 28 Days Later, the UK gets quarantined because of this outbreak of what's called the rage virus, where people aren't zombies like where they die and wake up. It's just that in seconds you take on this complete state of like homicidal rage, and but that's not dissimilar. I'm not exaggerating. When I was like a kid living back in the 80s, when mad cow broke out, there were worries and concerns that, because they didn't know when it began, that millions of people could already have mad cow, and there could be millions and millions of people who would go down in the virus in the next few years. And thankfully that didn't happen, even though it did, unfortunately, jump from, the cattle-based version to mad cow in people, that, it did leap. And that's when people got really concerned. But there was also, a great deal of nonsense and fear-mongering. And that sort of, nonsense and fear-mongering plays equally into the whole Russian angle of, trying to mess with the mindset of the U.S. government.
I'm curious as to what some of your concerns for the future in the manipulation and disinformation in the UFO phenomenon for political ends, either from Russia or anyone else's.
Well, from my perspective, the primary thing that the story that the book tells is of Russian manipulation. So I think the things to look out for, if somebody, sort of like a deep throat whistleblower type character surfaces with questionable or controversial documents, and there's a political slant to them, I think that's a very important thing to look out for. I'm sure that with these documents, if there's a political angle in the documents, then you can pretty much guarantee that political angle is there for a reason. Mm-hmm. So I think that in the future would be an important thing to look out for. And also, if you're a UFO researcher and you're someone who potentially, also works in the field of the Defense Department or, the intelligence community, but you happen to have a connection to or an interest in UFOs, anybody who is sort of approached by someone with a vaguely foreign accent, named Dimitri or whatever, it's things like that to look out for. I was kind of being a little bit, sort of tongue-in-cheek there.
The honeypots.
But exactly. And I think you have to be aware of situations like that where it could be so easy to affect the mindset, where people don't necessarily realize or think carefully enough about what they're doing. I mean, a good example would be like when you go to the airport to make a flight. Well, because of just what one person did, everybody, without thinking, takes their shoes off. You know, you had the shoe bomber. It was one guy and it was one event. But now, when we go to the airport, we all take our shoes off without thinking. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but what I'm saying is that scenario has been ingrained in everybody's mind where you don't even think about it. You know, it's kind of like locking your front door after when you go out to work at 8 o'clock in the morning. You just lock the door and go. And that's kind of like a similar thing. We go to the airport, we just take our shoes off because of what somebody did 15 years ago or whatever it did, or when it was done. And so it shows how the human mind can be manipulated very quickly to a point where we don't give it a second thought. And when you don't give something a second thought, then you can really find yourself in an awkward and dangerous situation, you know.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop, Nick. Where can people find you, and also where can people get the book?
Well, people can find me at Facebook. If you type in Nick Redfern, you'll see there's a few of us, but you'll see me if you scroll down and a few places. People can reach me at Twitter at Nick Redfern UFO. I also have a blog, World of Whatever, and also if people are interested in reading the book, Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, you can get it off the shelves in Barnes & Noble. And you can also buy it on Amazon as well.
Excellent, Nick. Always enjoy having you on. It's been extremely informative.
Thanks, guys.
You are really a wealth of knowledge. Yep. Stay on the line for us. We're going to close this section out, and we will be back to close out this show on Conspirinormal.
If you want your HR team to hire top talent for your company, tell them about ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology identifies people with the right skills, education, and experience, and actively invites them to apply to your company's job posts, so you get qualified candidates fast. It's no wonder that ZipRecruiter is rated #1 by employers in the U.S. This rating comes from hiring sites on Trustpilot with over 1,000 reviews. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/Conspirinormal. That's ZipRecruiter.com/Conspirinormal. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
Okay, welcome back to Conspirinormal, guys. So that was an interesting interview with Nick Redfern. I was particularly glad to get his perspective on all that.
Yeah, we've been wanting to do that for a little bit since those articles came out and he wrote his book.
Yeah. I wanted to add something to that, and it's interesting because I listened to this last night on another podcast, which is the Revolutions podcast, Mike Duncan, and he's talking about the Russian Revolution, and he's going through like the pre-Russian Revolution era and talking about how the Tsarist Russia actually had their agents in every capital in Europe because Russia was seen as like the bastion of conservatism, and that if there was ever any kind of quote unquote liberal revolt,
sounds familiar.
They could put it down. Yeah,
sounds familiar.
Yeah. It's kind of like what goes around comes around. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So this has been something that's been going on for a while. This is nothing new. So it was real interesting
East
to get
versus
that
West
point of view from Nick Redfern. And Nick is always one of our favorite guests on the show. Guys, we just did a live interview with Tim Binnall, and
we're very
who is going to be speaking at the Strange Realities Conference. Yeah, we were honored to be there as he was talking to us about the conference and a few other things about how he didn't like his iPhone 10. And so that will be available at Binnall of America. That will be available at his wherever his podcast.
It's definitely
is.
A milestone for me. I listen to a lot of Binnall of America.
Yeah, that's how you came into some of this stuff. So it's an interesting full circle. So guys, this is it. This is the last episode that we are going to put out before the Strange Realities Conference on October 19th.
We sound like public television. You're probably tired of it. We don't care.
Yeah. We have sold some tickets online, but it is really going to behoove you guys, especially if you are in Nashville, because we realize now there's probably not a lot of people going to be coming in from out of town. Those people have probably already bought all their tickets. But if you have not, it is $30 still pre-sale until October 18th, which is only a few days away from when we are posting this episode.
It's a steal.
So guys, please get your tickets in as soon as you can. Otherwise, at the door, you're going to be paying $40. We can't emphasize that enough.
And we are anticipating quite a local rush, and you may just not be able to get in.
That is a possibility. We only have like 100. We can only fit 100 people in that room. So please try to get there as soon as you can that day. And it starts at 10 o'clock, and we're going to start the ball rolling at about like 10:15 with the first presentation. And we are going all day. So guys, emphasize again, $30 pre-sale, $40 at the door. And come join us at the Strange Realities Conference. Yeah, so guys, we still have our Patreon available, and Serpo can tell you where that is.
You can find that at patreon.com/Conspirinormal. Make a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. Again, that was strangerealitiesconference.com.
Absolutely, guys. We really hope to see you there. Next time you hear this episode, we will not be talking about it. Just a couple of notes. We do have music at the end of the Strange Realities Conference. We are going to have Jason Von Stein, who is actually my cousin. He's going to be playing his father's songs. And we have all the way from Indiana, from a farm just outside of Indianapolis.
Goat farm.
Yeah, a goat farm. We have Goat Herder going to be playing their white metal, black metal. I don't really know, but they are going to be there. That's our good friend Jedediah, who is also going to be at the conference. He's bringing his entire band to entertain you guys, and we have a live DJ, and Serpo can tell you who that is.
And we have a very good friend of mine, day one, DJ Mike Vulcan, playing outer space techno and crazy disco and all kinds of cool futuristic stuff.
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
Take us into the night.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's going to be a good ending to the night, and very appropriate as well. So guys, strangerealitiesconference.com. We are in the final days. All right, I think that's it. One mother announcement. You know we have a conference going on. The next episode is going to be delayed by a few days than what you're used to. But this man over here, Serpo Stevenson, he does all the editing. He is going to be at the conference, and he's going to be there to help entertain our guests that we have the next day. So he's not going to be able to do any editing. So we're going to delay the shows. But guys, you just had this episode with Nick Redfern. Before that, you had another episode with Guy Malone. There's plenty of episodes there. Catch up on an old one if you'd like. Or if not, join Patreon and you'll find much more. But we will be back probably in about a week and a half to 2 weeks. So until then, guys, we'll talk to you later on Conspirinormal. StrangeRealitiesConference.com.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel.